In this high-tech crime prevention facility, one man has been recruited to play a simulated game. The objective, to hunt down the ultimate virtual reality killer, Sid 6.7. There's only one problem. The computer changed the program. Now, he's in the real world.
He's interactive.
On your knees, now!
He doesn't enjoy the game unless he's playing against his favorite opponent, and that's me.
We're back with another episode of Bratspin Reviews. I'm host, filmmaker Jared Bratt. Joining me, as always, host, filmmaker, interviewer, reviewer, Mr. Carl Diamond.
Calm your VR-pumped ass down. It's a line from the movie.
We'll get into it. And back with Carl and myself, fellow host, filmmaker, interviewer, reviewer, Mr. Robert Mitchell.
Hey Carl, hey Jared, it's great to be in conversation with you all again. Putting my VR goggles on as we speak.
Before you do, can you reach in the back seat and hand me that crowd pleaser?
Oh, no problem. I have a couple, being in Texas and all.
That's such a badass, awesome line. This episode, we're talking about Virtuosity, released in 1995 and directed by Brett Leonard. One of my biggest takeaways, and Carl, you brought this up offline, hindsight is 2020, right? So now we can look back at this movie, and as you were saying, this is just part of that whole window of time when Hollywood was doing these tech, futuristic, cyberpunk movies. But I would go back to 1992 with The Lawnmower Man, also directed by Brett Leonard, Sneakers with Robert Redford and Sidney Poitier. But then look at this year, we're in the magical year of 1995, and you got Johnny Mnemonic, Hackers, and Strange Days, all in 95, and Virtuosity.
Yeah, it's interesting because just a note on cyberpunk at that time. Cyberpunk I've always loved it, but I feel like it was big in the late 80s and the 90s and then kind of went away a little in the 2000s and really hit it back again in the 2010s. And ironically enough, the stuff that was coming out in 1995 and before that and up into The Matrix is considered, that's true cyberpunk.
I really think 95, I feel like this movie is part of the sweet spot of this whole genre.
I will say this, it has the same amount of polish as Johnny Mnemonic.
Strange Days was the one I was thinking of the most. Strange Days is more dystopian. That aside, with the soundtrack and just the production values, I felt like Virtuosity, oddly, could be taking place in the same spin-off universe.
I just think it's all part of the same pie. If you are a fan of the genre, this is going to be on your list.
Had you already seen this movie?
I saw it in college when On Demand first came out. I'd had a few things to drink and may or may not have smoked something. I sat down and watched it and go, oh, this is kind of goofy and a little hokey and a little too colorful and bright for the kind of cyberpunk stuff that I was expecting and looking for at the time. I'd just watched Tetsuo, Strange Days, and Blade Runner: The Final Cut had just come out maybe a year or two earlier. So I was like, this isn't the same kind of idea that those films were. And then upon the rewatch, my outlook on it changed completely. And I felt that, oh yeah, this totally belongs in the same section as those films. But on Virtuosity, yeah, Denzel, it's definitely one of the movies he was making at that time. By that, I mean, it's it kind of fits in with all the gritty cop movies he was making in the 90s.
Well, this movie is very much that Hollywood cop movie. It's that thrown into the whole tech future world, which just gives it this fresh layer to it.
When we were talking about the 90s cyberpunk films, one thing that also, because I thought it was more maybe about privacy, and then when I learned it was more about virtual reality, and a theme I picked up upon was the spectacle of violence. But as far as literature at the time, one thing that came to mind immediately was William Gibson's Virtual Light was published in 1993, and it has a really cool cover of this guy wearing a pair of VR goggles. The 90s were definitely very much happening with what was going on cinematically and in books, talking about this world that we were living in that was rapidly changing. And then eventually, not at this time, but a couple years later, we start panicking and freaking out about the Y2K bug.
Fear of computers was definitely something that was hot at that time.
But they also just make it so damn fun. Yeah, this movie's still an action movie. It's still Denzel. He just elevates any material. I think it was really cool that he would do these genre movies.
Just to show an example of the power he had at that time, So the original script, the idea was that there's going to be a kiss at the end with Kelly Lynch's character and Denzel Washington's character. It's a whole like love subplot. Denzel comes on and completely drops that. He says, we're not doing that. One site says he thought it was weak. Another site says he dropped it because he thought box office would suffer if there was an interracial couple. But I don't know. It might have just been a weak subplot.
He's coming off some of his best work already, Philadelphia and Malcolm X. So he's already been nominated for Academy Awards. You would assume on some level that he now has a lot of offers and he has a lot more creative options. I'm sure there's a lot of people at this time period trying to get him a script. So it is interesting that he saw something in this material that he wanted to act in this film. I obviously cannot speak to any level of what Mr. Washington's viewpoints were, but just as far as me watching it as a viewer in the storyline, I appreciated what Kelly Lynch, who we may recognize from Drugstore Cowboy, the Gus Van Sant movie, her playing this character, Dr. Carter, is, not treated as some sort of sidekick that he has to rescue. She inserts herself into that story with him. And I think for me as a viewer watching her, and she played a powerful professional woman in this film, for them to have a kiss would cheapen the story for me.
They're definitely both solid enough characters on their own, and they don't need to have like a romance thing. It wouldn't make any sense. You can have allies without having to make lovers out of them.
I saw this in theaters as a kid, and I'm trying to think back if I assumed that there was a romantic relationship between them that was implied, or if I just saw them as, they're just partners. I really love, the soundtrack is still a banger. There's actually a couple tracks that are also on the Strange Days soundtrack. There's a lot of Peter Gabriel, and I liked how the score for the movie pulls some cues from the actual Peter Gabriel songs. Something about his voice as like a backdrop to the tone of this movie. It's the opposite of hokey for me.
Hi, Daddy.
Speaking about the soundtrack, Jared, and how much you enjoyed it, there's also a really cool piece of business where Russell Crowe, his character name is Sid 6.7, and I talked about Dr. Carter. Later in the story, he breaks into a house and kidnaps her daughter. There's a song that's playing over that sequence called Photograph Kills, and it's by a band called 30 Odd Foot of Grunts, and that's actually Russell Crowe's band from Australia.
Oh.
Yeah, I knew he was a musician.
Russell Crowe at this time is not really well known. In 95, he's also in two other films that are released called The Quick and the Dead by Sam Raimi.
Love that movie.
And another film called No Way Back. To interject one other point about how unknown Russell Crowe is at this moment in time in America, in Hollywood. In 97, he's in LA Confidential as one of the leads and directed by Curtis Hanson. And I remember hearing years ago, Curtis Hanson was looking for people that American audience weren't familiar with. So that's how unwell known Russell Crowe is as an actor in this picture in 1995.
Curtis Hanson cast Russell Crowe based off of Romper Stomper.
Yeah, the Australian picture.
It's a great movie. Great performance.
What a remarkable run he would have a couple years later, especially with Gladiator in 2000.
In the next 10 years, he'd like rise up, hit his peak, and then crash.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
I just think it's kind of crazy, though, because I remember even the marketing for this movie really put a lot on Russell Crowe's shoulders. I certainly remember as a kid, I'm like, I have no clue who this actor is.
He's the best part of the movie.
By far.
Boom! Boom!
Come on. Just because I'm carrying around the joy of killing your family inside me doesn't mean we can't be friends.
When we were placing this film in context of those 90s movies, of course, the decade culminates in the blockbuster spectacle of 1999's The Matrix. Earlier on in this film, there's that blurry opening credit sequence. Then you saw all of these people, all these guys in the same kind of gray suits. Seeing it all these years later, you're like, oh, that looks like The Matrix. And then there's a part where they give foot chase to somebody, and Parker Barnes, Denzel Washington's character, looks up to the beautiful blue sky with white clouds, and it glitches. And I'm like, oh, there's a glitch in The Matrix. And then this foot chase culminates with them running to this building where there's a happy face of just two eyes and a smile, which made me think of an emoji. So I thought it was cool to see these little moments of The Matrix way before that movie became the juggernaut of the movie it was. So I give props to this movie storytelling for, breaching some of those visual themes way before that movie came out.
Yeah, in a time when there isn't a lot of computer usage amongst the general public, or as far as like stuff that we consider, we just take for granted today, where it's like this is part of how society is. Like a lot of the stuff that like emojis and even having an email in 1995 was pretty like either you were really into computers or you were high up in the business world.
Did this movie ever say what year it's taking place in?
Not to my knowledge, no. It's a very near future Los Angeles.
According to Wikipedia, it's 1999.
One of the interesting parts about that, though, is you think as the story unfolds, you start seeing the world around them. But as far as me watching this film and taking my notes, you think they're out there, but you learn later, no, they're actually still in virtual reality. So we don't actually know what this place looks like in the time that the story is unfolding.
Wait, Rob, are you saying the whole movie is taking place inside of virtual reality?
Well, yeah, because they let him out, right? I mean, at some point, I guess we should address the overall story of the movie. Denzel Washington was a police officer who's now serving time in prison. The opening scene, him and another person are police officers. It isn't until several minutes into the picture that it cuts to this giant computer room and they're in what they call rigs. And then there are these virtual reality headsets that they're in. You know, the story unfolds. Sid 6.7 gets unleashed. He transforms and he's constantly evolving. And there's a whole other story element with that, with the person that created him. Anyway, so a deal's made that Denzel Washington would get his freedom if he actually captures him. If he doesn't capture him, he'll serve out the rest of his sentence. I assume that the film is now into the real world. They leave the prison, he's driving a vehicle, you see all these homeless people in carts and all that by the prison walls. However, as the film goes on, there's a part where they're actually back in virtual reality. Now, maybe I missed something. It was my very first viewing. You know what I mean? So it could be on me. But what I interpreted was all this middle section that I thought was out in the world, they were actually still in virtual reality rigs trying to find Sid 6.7. Maybe it's ambiguous. Maybe I missed something. Or maybe the whole thing takes place in virtual reality and he's loose in the internet world.
That's a fascinating observation, Rob.
But when he pulls out the fucking, the diamond, what do they call it, from Sid?
I thought it was just character cube.
Character cube, that's exactly what it is. You're right.
To me, from that point, because you don't see it, but then the movie restarts a scene and they're back up on the roof and then he throws Denzel and like, what's going on? I think from that point, that's when they jumped back into VR. If you're telling me the whole movie, even the reality that Denzel's been let free into, is still part of the VR, then I've been just watching this movie wrong all my life.
The way I watched the film, I took this note. Unlike most dystopian movies, once the film moves into Barnes looking for Sid in the real world, we see the bright sun of Los Angeles, and they actually go to the beach and whatnot. Again, I watched this film for the first time. I took a lot of notes. You know, it's a film that probably I would like better appreciate even more upon a rewatch.
It's certainly more of a mindfuck movie if the reality portion is actually VR.
To be kind, the film doesn't hold one's hand. I think that's what kind of threw me off the first time when I watched it back in college. The brightness of everything. When you compare this movie to like Johnny Mnemonic or The Matrix or Blade Runner or any other cyberpunk dystopia movie, none of those movies really take place during the day. Usually when it's daytime, it's in the desert or it's like there's smog everywhere. Yeah, they have sun shining. It kind of throws you off.
To me, it had a bit of that Tony Scott look to it.
Overall, I found the story muddled in places. Going back to what I talked about, the spectacle of violence, he goes to a UFC fight, and that literally is a spectacle of violence. He's all hepped in it. He starts fighting people in the audience and whatnot. Anyway, there was very interesting stuff that was happening near the end of this film where he's looking for an audience of people, and he wants to be seen. As Dr. Carter says to Barnes at one point, he's like a child. He wants an audience. Much later in the third act of the film, all of a sudden we start learning some real-world stuff. America has an immigration crisis. And then a guy on a television program also starts talking about if you close off U.S. borders to immigration, you close off your soul to the future. This is really cool piece of business thematically and story-wise that could have been explored much earlier in the picture and flushed out the world building, which I thought was lacking in the movie. Anyway, Sid gets into this television station and shoots the guy in the head on live television. So he finds this audience and he executes this guy on live television, craving this audience and the spectacle of violence.
I took note of the border stuff. I chalked it up very generally to just this movie being another example of 90s sci-fi movies that we're looking back on now as we're all older and realizing how the movies we love are starting to align with where we're headed or where we are.
Could it be Hollywood prepping us for the future they already know is happening? At the end of the UFC fight, we gotta talk about how everyone's yelling kapow the entire time.
Yeah.
They're chanting kapow, kapow. It's like, is this a Looney Tunes cartoon?
There's two 90s moments in that scene as well. One, Michael Buffer, let's get ready to rumble. Can't get more 90s than that. And one of the fighters is an actual UFC fighter and WWF star of the time, Ken Shamrock. So that's two 90s moments out of many that I pulled out of this film.
I was just thinking, Russell Crowe really is great because watching him, he's very unpredictable. Like in the scene when he's at the club composing his symphony of screams, when he has the gun aimed at somebody, you don't know who he's going to pick off, who he's going to let live.
And that ties into the actual meaning behind the name of the movie, Virtuosity, which means to excel in something musically or artistically. I know it sounds like virtual reality, which is probably why they called it that, but Virtuosity, the scene that is most related to what the title of the movie is that club scene.
1, 2, 3, shut up!
Another great 90s moment, there's a band playing, and Tracy Lords, porn star trying to break into Hollywood, is the lead singer.
I think at that point she had passed porn and was in B movies. I think she was like a John Waters regular, but I don't think she'd really done Hollywood.
What I was getting at, though, is that, yeah, Russell Crowe sells the threat. And if you buy the threat, then you buy the stakes.
Yeah, because even if you don't quite understand why everything is happening, you do understand that this is a robot that is made up of a bunch of serial killers and that he is trying to kill people and cause mayhem.
Which is something that is a very quick pass, and that could have been explored more to great effect. I thought that was a really wicked idea. That's another thing I wanted to mention is I really loved, there's a really awesome moment where he's in this decked out suit and it's the low shot of the shoes and the pants and he's strutting and Saturday Night Fever's playing. And then this is leading up to the great climax of Barnes and him. They're going to throw down. And it made me think what Elton John told us all, that Saturday night's all right for fighting. And yeah, we're going to get into a fight soon in this movie.
I love how he's just walking, he's strutting with that suit, and you get that one guy who just gives him a high five.
Yeah, it's awesome. We talked about character actors, and I just want to mention a couple. William Fichtner is in this. He's great in everything. He said that 80% of his scenes were cut. God only knows what made the cutting room floor. Maybe that's one reason the film, for me, feels in places muddled. Louise Fletcher, she plays the head of this company with the VR. We would know her most famous role would be as Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
You're kidding me. That's the same actress?
I knew she looked familiar.
William Forsythe is another great character actor. He's in a shit ton of stuff. I got to interview him years ago. He's a great personality, great guy. That's one thing I really enjoyed about watching this picture yesterday was seeing all of these great actors. Obviously, it's anchored by Denzel and Russell Crowe, who does a remarkable job playing Sid 6.7, who pretty much doesn't show much emotion, which is always difficult to pull that off. There's parts of the movie that really made me think of, Terminator.
It might not be fully fleshed out, but I liked how he uses his robot arm to burst through the fan to get to the kid at the end.
That was nice. You think he'd use it more than once, though?
But I really wanted them to go like Terminator 2 on us, just see all the skin come off.
There's definitely hints of that.
Yeah, there's hints of it, but I would have loved to have seen the full thing.
I agree.
I feel like there must have been scenes where they did that, because, Rob, like you said, stuff was cut.
I wanted to also just talk quickly about the nanocells, where Clyde has this giant snake, cuts it in half, and then we see the nanotechnology working where the snake gets rejuvenated. I like that visually, and I like the technological stuff that was happening there.
That actor really sold that snake puppet. But yeah, the effect of the nanomachines eating glass was really cool.
Clyde is played by Kevin J. O'Connor, who people may recognize from Deep Rising and The Mummy and Van Helsing. So yeah, again, another great character actor. This is why I can't, for me personally, I just don't throw this film away. The graphics don't bother me. It's of the era.
It's not like where you watch Lawnmower Man or certain parts in Johnny Mnemonic and go, oh, look at that. That's dated CGI. Some people laugh at it and some people will go, oh, that's just what it was at the time.
For me, the special effects, like, I think even like the jankiness of maybe the outdatedness still oddly enough helps to create how the tech works.
I will say that one thing, another comparison to Strange Days. I feel like both Strange Days and Virtuosity say a lot, or at least make an attempt to say a lot. Whereas Strange Days says a lot and is given a lot of time to say what it sets out to say. Virtuosity tries to say almost the same amount, but it's, it isn't given nearly the amount of time. You get either the setup for something that doesn't happen, or you get the punchline for something that wasn't set up.
To me, this isn't a bad movie by any means.
No, I don't think it's a bad movie by any stretch of imagination. Is it a great movie? Well, no, it isn't that either. Is it enjoyable? I enjoyed my hour and 45 minutes with it. When I watch these movies, I'm looking at a lot of things. For example, in every cop procedural, there's this standard line. In this one, where Barnes is getting let out after he makes the deal, he's handed his shield back. And then, just before leaving, he's like, yeah, but where's my gun? It completely reverses the cop procedural. Give me your badge and gun. They literally give him back his badge and gun. I just love that.
What?
Where's my gun?
I think we're seeing a lot of pieces of things that are cool. Does it all work together? I don't know, but I don't think so. But overall, the film has a lot of cool ideas.
We've mentioned that this movie is part of this whole genre that Hollywood was doing in this very specific window of time, and I feel like Virtuosity could very easily be a movie that gets lost in that whole slew of films that we all think of. If you haven't seen Virtuosity, going on Denzel Washington movies alone, this one definitely deserves a watch.
Yeah, it's a good popcorn film. It feels like a movie you'd rent from Blockbuster in the 90s and go, it was whatever, but we had a good time with my friends. Just from a cyberpunk point of view, if you're looking for more cyberpunk stuff, this counts. This was a cyberpunk movie made during the cyberpunk era.
On my Google Doc, I have like 7 pages of things I typed up while watching the movie. This is the very last sentence that I wrote. A film where everything is not what it seems on the surface level. So again, I will go with my theory that this whole film takes place in virtual reality.
I love that this has been your observation of the film, Rob. As they used to say, it's great TV.
Game over. That's reality for you.
He never uses his badge. He never draws.
Yeah, there's a part where he's running on the metro and he shoots. There's the whole piece of business where Sid is on the metro train. He's got a hostage and Barnes is running through this whole crowd. That was a perfect time for him to be wearing his shield as a necklace. He does not. So I agree with you. There's moments where he could have been wearing it.
Even the child actor is now a big actor.
Who's the child actor?
It's Kaylee Cuoco, whatever. Big Bang Theory.
I don't watch that.
The Flight Attendant. Did you watch that? That's one. The Flight Attendant's great. She's a blonde actress. She has a career. Like she's a movie star.
I'll take your word for it.
Just do a quick Google search after. If there was a movie where the trailer opened up with the voiceover guy going, "Have you ever wanted to surf the internet, but actually surf the internet?" I'm sold immediately. Immediately, I'll go see that in theaters. Strange Waves. Yeah, no, we'll have to find the shooting script and then maybe find a way to talk to the director. Email him and say, "Hey, no one really gives a will you come on our podcast and talk about Virtuosity?"
We talked about it for 3 hours.